Commandment, Genesis, by Edwina Longbottom. Chapter 1, The Implant. The room was bathed in sterile white light, the hum of machinery a low, unrelenting backdrop. Rows of cradles lined the walls, each holding a newborn swaddled in pristine white linen. Monitors above each cradle blinked in rhythmic intervals, displaying vital signs alongside a countdown clock ticking ominously toward zero. This was the Covenant ward, the cradle of humanity's purity, or so the Theocracy claimed. Elijah Carter stood at the observation window, his arms crossed tightly against his chest. The glass pane felt cold beneath his fingertips as he leaned forward, watching the orderly procession of nurses tending to the infants. Each movement was deliberate, every action precise. There was no room for error in the Theocracy's holiest ritual, the implantation of the Covenant device. Behind him, Dr. Miriam Ansari, the lead surgeon of the facility, approached with her usual briskness. Her white robes rustled faintly, and the faint smell of antiseptic trailed her steps. "Elijah," she said, her voice clipped but not unkind. "You're here early." "Couldn't sleep," he replied without turning. "Same dream again." "The one about Hannah?" He nodded. The memory of his sister's laughter, so bright and carefree, clashed violently with the image of her lifeless body, dissolving into nothingness on the cold floor of their home. Her crime had been so small, so human, a fleeting moment of jealousy over a friend's new toy. The implant had judged her unworthy, and the judgment had been swift. Miriam sighed, stepping up beside him. "It's been years, Elijah. You have to let it go." "Let it go," he said, his voice sharper than intended. He gestured to the infants below. "How can I let it go when this abomination continues every single day?" Miriam's eyes narrowed. "Careful," she warned. "You're speaking dangerously." Elijah bit back a retort, turning his gaze back to the ward. He knew better than to voice his doubts openly. The Theocracy's reach extended into every shadow, and the Covenant devices were not the only tools they used to maintain control. Yet, the words burned inside him, a fire that refused to be extinguished. "It's starting," Miriam said, shifting her attention to the center of the room. A priest, draped in ceremonial robes of deep crimson, entered the ward. In his hands, he carried the Covenant device, a small metallic sphere that pulsed with an eerie blue light. It was no larger than a marble, yet its purpose loomed over every aspect of human existence. The priest began the ritual, chanting ancient verses that had been passed down for generations. Nurses moved with clockwork precision, lifting the first infant from its cradle and bringing it to the central altar. The child's cries echoed briefly before being silenced by the priest's soothing touch. "May this child walk in the light of purity," the priest intoned, pressing the device against the infant's chest. A faint hiss filled the air as the device fused seamlessly with the newborn's skin. The monitors above the cradle updated instantly, the countdown clock resetting to the child's expected lifespan. Elijah turned away, unable to watch. The ceremony was designed to inspire awe, to reinforce the sanctity of the Theocracy's laws. But to him, it was a grim reminder of the system's absolute power and its absolute cruelty. That evening, Elijah sat alone in his small apartment, the city's spires visible through the narrow window. The light from the cathedral's central tower bathed the skyline in a soft golden glow, a constant reminder of the Theocracy's presence. On his desk lay the day's work, schematics for the next generation of Covenant devices. He traced a finger over the diagrams, his mind racing. He had been a righteousness engineer for nearly a decade, perfecting the devices that had become the cornerstone of human society. It was a position of honor, yet it felt like a chain around his neck. Each advancement he made only tightened the Theocracy's grip on humanity. His thoughts were interrupted by the faint chime of his communication terminal. A message blinked on the screen, the sender marked as anonymous. "Elijah Carter, we know you question the truth. If you seek answers, meet us at the base of the western spire at midnight. Come alone." His heart raced as he read the message again, his mind torn between fear and curiosity. Was it a trap, a test of loyalty? Or could it be the opportunity he had been silently yearning for, a chance to challenge the system that had taken so much from him? Elijah leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. Midnight was hours away, but the decision loomed over him like a shadow. For the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of hope and the heavy weight of impending danger. As the clock struck midnight, Elijah stood at the base of the western spire, his breath visible in the cool night air. The city was eerily quiet, the only sounds the distant hum of machinery and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. "You came," a voice said from the shadows. Elijah turned sharply, his hand instinctively moving to the small knife concealed in his coat. A figure stepped into the dim light, their face obscured by a hood. "Who are you?" Elijah demanded. "A seeker like you," the figure replied. They extended a hand, revealing a small metallic object. "And this is the key to your questions." Elijah hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "What is it?" "Proof," the figure said simply. "Proof that the covenant devices are not what they seem." The figure placed the object in his hand and stepped back into the shadows. "Find the archive," they said before disappearing into the night. Elijah stared at the object, its surface cool against his palm. It was a data chip, the kind used to store encrypted information. He clenched his fist around it, his mind racing with possibilities. For the first time in his life, the path before him was uncertain, and for the first time, he welcomed it. Chapter 2: The Archive. The morning light filtered through the narrow slats of Elijah's window, casting long shadows across his desk. The data chip sat in the center, its dull metallic sheen both inviting and ominous. He had spent the night staring at it, his thoughts an endless cycle of questions and doubts. Now, as the city stirred to life beyond his walls, he knew he couldn't delay any longer. He inserted the chip into his personal terminal, a device carefully shielded from the Theocracy's monitoring systems. The screen flickered, then displayed a simple message: "Enter the light to uncover the darkness." Below it was a single command prompt waiting for input. Elijah hesitated before typing "Access." The screen filled with lines of text, accompanied by images and videos, evidence of a truth he had never dared imagine. The covenant devices, hailed as divine instruments, were nothing more than the culmination of centuries-old technology designed for control. The original schematics bore no symbols of faith, only the cold precision of scientific engineering. The implant's acid mechanism, touted as a means of purity, was developed for efficiency, ensuring no remains were left to challenge the narrative of divine judgment. One file stood out among the rest, labeled simply Genesis Protocol. Elijah opened it, his breath catching as he read. The file detailed the early days of the Theocracy, when a group of technocrats had risen to power in the aftermath of a global collapse. They had crafted the illusion of divine intervention, using the covenant devices to establish absolute authority. The 10 Commandments, chosen for their simplicity and universality, became the foundation of this new order. The final entry in the file chilled him to his core. Those who control the devices control the commandments. A sudden knock at his door jolted him from his thoughts. Elijah quickly ejected the chip and hid it beneath a loose floorboard before crossing the room. He opened the door to find Miriam standing there, her expression unreadable. "May I come in?" she asked. Elijah stepped aside, his heart pounding. "What brings you here?" "I've heard whispers," she said, closing the door behind her. "About you, about doubts." Elijah's stomach turned. "Whispers can be dangerous," he replied cautiously. Miriam met his gaze, her voice lowering. "You're not the only one who questions, Elijah. There are others. But questioning alone is suicide. We must act together." For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the city beyond. Then Elijah nodded, the weight of his decision settling over him. "What do you need me to do?" Miriam smiled faintly. "There's a place we call the archive. It's where the truth began. If you're ready, I can take you there." Elijah glanced toward the floorboard where the chip lay hidden, then back at Miriam. "I'm ready," he said. The journey to the archive was fraught with tension. Miriam led Elijah through a series of underground tunnels, their walls damp and covered in moss. The air was heavy, and the faint echo of their footsteps only heightened the sense of isolation. "How long has this been here?" Elijah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Since before the Theocracy," Miriam replied. "It was part of the old world's infrastructure, repurposed to hide what they didn't want us to see." They reached a heavy steel door, its surface rusted but intact. Miriam entered a code into a concealed panel, and the door creaked open, revealing a cavernous space filled with shelves of dusty files and outdated machinery. At the center of the room stood a massive terminal, its screen glowing faintly. "This is the archive," Miriam said, gesturing around them. "Every lie, every manipulation, it's all here." Elijah approached the terminal, his hands trembling as he activated it. The screen displayed a familiar phrase, "Enter the light to uncover the darkness." "This is where it begins," Miriam said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Are you ready to see the truth?" Elijah nodded, his resolve hardening. "Show me." Chapter 3, Shadows of Control. The screen before Elijah pulsed faintly, its light casting an eerie glow across the archive. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, each keystroke feeling heavier than the last. With Miriam standing silently behind him, he typed the access command, "Unveil." The terminal responded instantly, revealing an intricate web of files. Diagrams, video feeds, and schematics layered over each other, detailing the extent of the Theocracy's manipulation. Elijah scrolled through, his eyes darting between documents that outlined the creation of the Covenant devices, their enforcement algorithms, and the deeply flawed philosophy underpinning the system. "Look at this," he murmured, pulling up a file labeled Field Testing Report 12.5.1. The document outlined early experiments on volunteers, their lives extinguished by implants for actions as trivial as sneezing during a prayer. "They've been perfecting control for centuries," Miriam said, her voice tight, "every iteration more efficient, more ruthless." Elijah paused at a live feed labeled Command Nexus. It showed a vast control room, its walls lined with monitors displaying the lives of countless citizens. Men and women in uniform sat at consoles, their faces illuminated by cold blue light. "This is the heart of it," Elijah said, pointing at the screen. "Every action monitored, every breath calculated. This isn't faith, it's tyranny." Miriam nodded, her jaw set. "The question is, what do we do about it?" The sound of footsteps echoed faintly through the tunnels outside the archive, pulling Elijah from his thoughts. Miriam tensed, motioning for him to stay quiet. She drew a small device from her bag, pressing it against the terminal's edge. A soft hum indicated the data was being copied. "We've been followed," she whispered. "We need to leave now." Elijah glanced toward the door, his mind racing. The weight of the truth he had uncovered pressed against him, but so did the reality of their situation. They couldn't allow the archive to fall into enemy hands. "There's a fail-safe," Miriam said, nodding toward a lever on the wall. "It'll destroy everything." "And us?" Elijah asked. "If we're caught, we're dead anyway." She replied, "But we can't let them have this." Elijah hesitated, his eyes locking with Miriam's. Then he nodded, his resolve firm. Together, they moved to the lever. As Miriam copied the last of the data, Elijah grasped the handle, pulling it with all his strength. A deafening roar filled the archive as self-destruct charges ignited. Flames consumed the shelves, and the terminal's screen shattered into fragments. Smoke billowed through the chamber, and Elijah grabbed Miriam's arm, pulling her toward an emergency exit. The tunnel beyond was a blur of heat and ash, but they pushed forward, their steps driven by the knowledge of what they now carried, the seed of rebellion. Chapter 4, Embers of Rebellion. The cold night air hit them like a wall as Elijah and Miriam emerged from the emergency exit into a desolate stretch of the old city's underground district. The archive burned behind them, a fiery beacon that illuminated the smog-heavy sky. Every breath Elijah took tasted of ash and adrenaline. Miriam didn't pause to admire their handiwork. She grabbed his arm and pulled him into the shadows. "We don't have long. They'll be on us soon." Elijah stumbled after her, his mind racing with the weight of their actions. The archive, the proof, was gone, but the data they had saved might be enough. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice ragged. "To the safe house," Miriam replied. "We regroup there. It's not far." The path through the abandoned tunnels was treacherous. Crumbling walls and stagnant puddles slowed their progress, but Miriam navigated with practiced precision. They moved in silence, the distant wail of sirens growing louder with every step. The safe house was hidden behind a rusted maintenance door, nearly indistinguishable from the decaying infrastructure around it. Miriam entered a code into a concealed panel, and the door groaned open, revealing a dimly lit room filled with scattered supplies, outdated monitors, and a small group of people waiting inside. Their faces turned to the newcomers, a mix of relief and suspicion etched into their features. One man, tall with a scar tracing the length of his jaw, stepped forward. This him, he asked, his voice low and gravely. Elijah Carter, Miriam confirmed. He's seen the truth, and we have the data. The man's gaze lingered on Elijah for a moment before he extended a hand. Name's Marcus. Welcome to the resistance. Elijah shook his hand, the gesture grounding him amidst the chaos. If what I've seen is true, he said, we have a lot of work to do. Miriam plugged the salvaged data chip into a terminal at the center of the room. The screen flickered to life, displaying fragments of the files they had saved. The room fell silent as the resistance members gathered around, their eyes wide with disbelief. This changes everything, a woman whispered. Her voice carried a tremor of hope. The people, they need to see this. And they will, Marcus said, his voice firm. But not yet. The Theocracy's reach is too strong. If we expose this now, they'll silence us before we can spread the truth. Elijah frowned. Then what do we do? How do we fight something so vast? Miriam stepped forward, pointing to the diagram of the Covenant devices. There's a way. The devices have a failsafe, a backdoor left by their original engineers. If we can access the command nexus, we can disable the entire system. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Disable it? Won't that kill everyone wearing an implant? Miriam shook her head. Not if we do it right. The backdoor wasn't designed to harm. It was designed to free. Elijah's chest tightened as he stared at the diagram. And if we fail? Miriam's silence was answer enough. Chapter 5, The Spark of Defiance. The following day began under the cover of secrecy. The safe house buzzed with activity, the air thick with tension as plans were set into motion. Elijah stood near the terminal, watching as Miriam worked through the data they had retrieved from the archive. Her fingers danced over the keyboard, piecing together a blueprint of their next steps. This, she said, pointing to a schematic on the screen, is the command nexus. It's buried beneath the cathedral. That's where the system is controlled. Elijah leaned closer, examining the intricate layout of tunnels and secured rooms. And this back door you mentioned, it's accessible from here? Miriam nodded. If we can bypass their firewalls and upload the override code, the entire network will collapse. And the implants? Elijah asked, his voice tinged with concern. They'll deactivate, Miriam assured him. The people will be free, but it won't be easy. The nexus is heavily guarded and will need to move quickly. Marcus stepped forward, his expression grim. We've got a small window. The Theocracy's patrols will be focused on the outskirts, searching for anyone linked to the archive's destruction. If we strike now, we might just have a chance. A hush fell over the room as Marcus's words sank in. The stakes were enormous, and failure meant certain death, not just for them, but for the resistance as a whole. By nightfall, the plan was set. A small team of resistance members, including Elijah, Miriam, and Marcus, would infiltrate the cathedral while the others created a diversion on the surface. The goal was clear: reach the command nexus, upload the override, and escape before the Theocracy could react. Elijah adjusted the pack on his back, the weight of the equipment grounding him as they prepared to leave. Miriam approached, placing a hand on his arm. You don't have to do this, she said softly. He met her gaze, determination burning in his eyes. I do. This is my fight as much as anyone's. Miriam nodded, a faint smile breaking through her tense expression. Then let's make it count. The streets were eerily quiet as the team moved through the shadows, their footsteps muffled against the cobblestones. The cathedral loomed ahead, its spires piercing the night sky like sentinels of the Theocracy's power. Elijah felt a chill crawl up his spine as they approached the side entrance, a narrow door hidden from plain view. Marcus produced a keycard, its surface worn from years of clandestine use. With a soft beep, the door unlocked, and the team slipped inside. The interior was as imposing as the exterior, with vaulted ceilings and walls adorned with intricate carvings. But there was no time to admire the architecture. They had a mission to complete. Miriam led the way, her knowledge of the cathedral's layout guiding them through a series of hallways and stairwells. The air grew colder as they descended, the hum of machinery growing louder with each step. Finally, they reached a steel door marked with the symbol of the Covenant device. Miriam motioned for the team to stop. This is it, she whispered. Beyond here is the command nexus. Marcus stepped forward, his weapon drawn. What's the plan? I'll handle the override, Miriam said. Elijah, You'll cover me. Marcus, you and the others hold off any guards who come our way. Marcus nodded, his jaw set. Let's move. The door opened with a hiss, revealing a cavernous room filled with consoles and monitors. At the center stood the mainframe, its core pulsating with a faint blue light. A handful of guards were stationed around the room, their backs turned as the team entered. Marcus wasted no time signaling for his team to neutralize the guards. The ensuing scuffle was brief but intense, leaving the room silent once more. Miriam rushed to the mainframe, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she initiated the override sequence. Elijah stood guard beside her, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of reinforcements. "How long will this take?" he asked. "Just a few minutes," Miriam replied, her voice steady despite the tension. "Keep them off me." As if on cue, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Marcus and his team took up defensive positions, their weapons trained on the entrance. The first wave of guards burst in, their shouts drowned out by the crack of gunfire. Elijah tightened his grip on his weapon, his heart pounding as he fired at an approaching guard. The room was chaos, a cacophony of shouting, gunfire, and the hum of the mainframe. Through it all, Miriam worked tirelessly, her focus unbroken. "I'm almost there," she called out. The words had barely left her mouth when a second wave of guards stormed in, their numbers overwhelming. Elijah's breath caught as he saw Marcus go down, a shot to his shoulder sending him sprawling. The resistance fighters fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered. "Miriam, we have to go," Elijah shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "Just a few more seconds," she yelled back. The mainframe let out a series of beeps, the blue light flickering as the override code took hold. Miriam grabbed a small drive from the console, her face alight with triumph. "It's done." Elijah pulled her toward the exit, firing at the remaining guards as they retreated. The team had suffered heavy losses, but the mission was a success. The override had been initiated, and the spark of defiance had been lit. Back at the safe house, the atmosphere was somber. The survivors gathered around the terminal, watching as reports of the system's collapse began to filter in. Screens displayed images of citizens ripping off their implants, their faces a mixture of relief and confusion. Miriam placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "We did it," she said softly. He nodded, though the weight of their losses hung heavy in his chest. "This is just the beginning," he said. "The Theocracy won't go down without a fight." "Then we'll keep fighting," Miriam replied, her voice resolute. "For them, for all of us." Elijah looked at the screens, the faces of a freed people staring back at him. The road ahead would be long and treacherous, but for the first time, there was hope. Chapter 6: Flames of Retaliation. The faint flicker of dawn's light crept through the cracks in the safe house's boarded windows, casting long shadows over the weary faces of the resistance members. The success of the mission to disable the command nexus had spread hope, but the cost was palpable. The losses weighed heavily on everyone, and the safe house was filled with a tense, solemn energy. Elijah sat against the wall, his head bowed as he cleaned his weapon. The night's events replayed in his mind like a relentless film reel, the chaos, the screams, and the sheer weight of responsibility bearing down on him. Across the room, Miriam was hunched over the terminal, her brow furrowed as she reviewed incoming reports. "Word's spreading," she said finally, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "The implants are shutting down, just as we planned. People are waking up, realizing they're free." "And the Theocracy?" Elijah asked, glancing up. "They're scrambling," Miriam replied, "but they're not going to take this lying down." As if on cue, Marcus, his arm in a makeshift sling, entered the room with a grim expression. "We've got trouble," he announced. "Scouts report that Theocracy enforcers are sweeping the sector. They're looking for us, and they're not holding back." A ripple of unease spread through the group. Elijah stood, his jaw tightening. "How long do we have?" "Not long," Marcus said. "They'll be here within the hour. We need to move." The safe house erupted into a flurry of activity as the resistance members gathered their supplies and prepared to evacuate. Miriam pulled Elijah aside, her voice low. "We need to protect the data," she said, gesturing to the terminal. "If they find this place, they'll destroy everything we've worked for." Elijah nodded. "I'll handle it. Get everyone out of here." Miriam hesitated, her eyes searching his. "Are you sure?" I'm sure, he said firmly. Go, I'll catch up. Reluctantly, Miriam joined the others as they filed out of the safe house. Elijah turned to the terminal, quickly transferring the critical data to a portable drive. The process felt agonizingly slow, every passing second a reminder of the impending danger. The sound of distant footsteps and muffled voices reached his ears, sending a jolt of adrenaline through him. He grabbed the drive and slipped it into his pocket, then moved to rig the terminal for destruction. If the enforcers got this far, they would find nothing but ash. The first wave of enforcers arrived with ruthless efficiency, their black uniforms blending into the shadows as they moved through the narrow alleyways. Elijah watched from a second-floor window, his breath steady as he prepared for what was to come. A small group of resistance fighters had stayed behind to provide cover, their weapons trained on the advancing enforcers. The air was thick with tension as the two sides faced off, the calm before the inevitable storm. The first shot rang out, shattering the silence and igniting chaos. Bullets whizzed through the air, ricocheting off walls and shattering windows. Elijah took aim, his movements precise as he picked off one enforcer after another. The resistance fighters held their ground, but the enforcers' numbers were overwhelming. Elijah, we can't hold them much longer, a voice shouted from below. I know, he called back. Fall back to the rendezvous point. I'll cover you. The fighters began their retreat, moving swiftly through the maze of alleyways. Elijah remained at the window, his focus unwavering as he provided cover fire. The enforcers pressed forward, their relentless advance a stark reminder of the Theocracy's power. When his ammunition ran low, Elijah knew it was time to move. He grabbed his weapon and the portable drive, slipping out the back of the safe house just as the enforcers breached the front door. The sound of their shouts and heavy boots echoed behind him as he disappeared into the labyrinth of the city. The rendezvous point was a small hidden bunker on the outskirts of the sector. The resistance fighters who had made it there were battered but alive, their relief palpable as Elijah joined them. You made it, Miriam said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and concern. What about the safe house? Gone, Elijah said, handing her the portable drive. But the data is safe. Miriam took the drive, her grip firm. This is everything, she said. This is what we'll use to finish what we started. Marcus stepped forward, his expression resolute despite the strain in his features. The Theocracy will come for us again. We've dealt them a blow, but they're not done. We need to strike back hard. Elijah nodded, his determination solidifying. Then we hit them where it hurts. The room fell silent as the weight of their decisions settled over them. The battle was far from over, but for the first time they had the upper hand. The Theocracy's grip was loosening, and the spark of rebellion had become a flame. Chapter 7, The Turning Tide. The bunker was dimly lit, the air thick with tension and determination as the resistance prepared for their next move. Maps and blueprints were spread across a makeshift table, illuminated by the faint glow of a single lamp. Elijah stood at its edge, studying the plans alongside Marcus and Miriam. Our next target is the broadcast tower, Marcus said, tapping a finger on the map. It's the main hub for Theocracy propaganda. If we take it out, we can disrupt their communications and reach the people with the truth. Miriam nodded. The data we recovered from the archive includes proof of the Theocracy's manipulations. If we can broadcast that to the public, we might spark widespread resistance. Elijah frowned. That tower will be heavily fortified. They'll expect us to go for it. That's why we'll hit them from 2 angles, Marcus replied. A smaller team will create a diversion at the checkpoint here. He pointed to a location near the edge of the sector, while the main team infiltrates the tower. Elijah looked around the room, his gaze meeting those of the resistance fighters gathered. Their faces were worn but resolute. We'll need to move fast and stay coordinated, he said. There's no room for error. As the team geared up for the mission, Miriam approached Elijah, her expression serious. You're leading the tower team, she said. Elijah raised an eyebrow. And you? I'll stay here and coordinate, she replied. You're the best shot we have at getting that message out. Elijah hesitated, the weight of responsibility settling over him. But he nodded, his resolve firm. I won't let you down. You never do, she said with a faint smile. The night was moonless, the city cloaked in shadows as the two teams split off in opposite directions. Elijah led the infiltration team through the winding alleys, his every step deliberate and silent. The broadcast tower loomed ahead, its spire piercing the sky like a dagger. They reached the perimeter, where two guards stood watch. Elijah signaled to his team, and within moments, the guards were subdued without a sound. The group moved quickly, slipping through the service entrance and into the tower's lower levels. The interior was a labyrinth of corridors and stairwells, the hum of machinery reverberating through the walls. Elijah's team navigated with precision, following the plans Miriam had provided. They encountered little resistance at first, but as they ascended, the opposition grew fiercer. Gunfire erupted in the narrow stairwell, the sharp cracks echoing like thunder. Elijah and his team pressed forward, their movements calculated and efficient. Each step brought them closer to the control room at the tower's peak. Meanwhile, the diversion team's assault at the checkpoint drew the bulk of the enforcers away. Explosions lit up the night, and the sound of conflict echoed through the city. The resistance fighters held their ground, their sacrifice ensuring the infiltration team could proceed. Back at the tower, Elijah's team breached the control room, taking out the guards stationed there. The space was filled with monitors and consoles, each displaying carefully curated propaganda that reinforced the Theocracy's narrative. Elijah moved to the main console, plugging in the portable drive containing the data from the archive. "We're in," he said, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he initiated the broadcast sequence. Miriam's voice crackled over his comm. "You're live in 30 seconds. Make it count." Elijah glanced at the team members around him. Their expressions were a mixture of exhaustion and hope. "This is it," he said. "Hold them off until the broadcast is complete." The monitors flickered, and then the propaganda feeds were replaced by the truth. Images and videos of the Theocracy's manipulations, the origins of the Covenant devices, and the systematic oppression were displayed for all to see. Across the city, people stopped in their tracks as the broadcast reached every screen and speaker. "This is the truth they've kept from you," Elijah said into the microphone, his voice steady and clear. "You've been lied to, controlled, and oppressed. But now you have a choice. Stand with us. Stand for freedom." The response was immediate. Across the city, citizens began to rise up, tearing off their implants and taking to the streets. The enforcers, caught off guard, struggled to contain the growing rebellion. At the tower, the fight intensified as reinforcements arrived. Elijah and his team held their ground, their determination unwavering. Just as the broadcast completed, an explosion rocked the building, sending shockwaves through the structure. "We've got to move," one of the team members shouted. Elijah grabbed the drive and led the team out, navigating the chaos of the crumbling tower. They emerged into the night, their mission a success, but their path uncertain. Back at the bunker, the atmosphere was electric. Reports poured in of uprisings in multiple sectors, the people emboldened by the broadcast. Miriam met Elijah at the entrance, her relief evident. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "We all did," Elijah replied, his gaze sweeping over the resistance fighters. "But this is just the beginning. The Theocracy won't go down without a fight." "Then we'll keep fighting," Miriam said, "for every person who stood up and for every life they've taken." Elijah nodded, the weight of the struggle ahead pressing against him. But for the first time, he felt the tide turning. The flame of rebellion had become an inferno, and the Theocracy's grip was slipping. Chapter 8: A Fractured Regime. The broadcast tower's broadcast was a spark that had ignited the city. Streets once dominated by silence now roared with the defiant cries of citizens. The Theocracy's symbols, etched into walls and monuments, were being torn down. Enforcers, overwhelmed and outnumbered, abandoned their posts or were driven back by the relentless tide of rebellion. Elijah watched from a rooftop overlooking the main square. Fires burned in the distance, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and freedom. Yet, despite the rising momentum, his thoughts were heavy with the knowledge that the Theocracy's heart still beat. It would take more than chaos in the streets to dismantle the system that had ruled with an iron fist for generations. "We've crippled their communications, but they're not broken," Miriam said, joining Elijah. Her face was smeared with soot, her eyes sharp and calculating. The cathedral remains intact, and the council will retreat there to consolidate their power. Elijah nodded. They'll use fear to regain control. If they reinforce the implants or reactivate them. Miriam placed a hand on his arm. We won't let it happen. We've come too far to let them win now. Back at the bunker, the resistance leadership convened around a battered table. Maps of the city and schematics of the cathedral were spread out, illuminated by the dim light of an old lamp. Marcus, his arms still in a sling, leaned heavily against the table. The cathedral is their last stronghold, Marcus said. It's not just a symbol, it's their fortress. If we take it, we take them. Elijah studied the plans. It won't be easy. The cathedral is heavily fortified, and they'll have every remaining enforcer stationed there. Miriam spoke up. The people are with us. If we coordinate an assault, we can overwhelm them. But we need to be strategic. A direct attack will cost us too many lives. What about the tunnels? Elijah asked, pointing to a network of underground passages on the map. Marcus's eyes narrowed. They've been sealed for decades. Even if we could reopen them, there's no guarantee they'll lead us all the way in. We don't need all the way, Miriam interjected. If we can get a small team inside, we can open the gates from within. The room fell silent as the gravity of the plan settled over them. Finally, Marcus nodded. It's risky, but it's our best shot. Preparations for the final assault began immediately. The resistance worked tirelessly, gathering supplies and rallying citizens. The tunnels were cleared of debris, their dark and damp passageways offering a glimmer of hope amidst the uncertainty. Elijah's team was selected for the infiltration. Miriam insisted on joining, despite the danger. You'll need someone to guide you through the security systems, she said. Elijah didn't argue. Her expertise was invaluable. Before they departed, Elijah addressed the resistance fighters gathered in the bunker. This is it, he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. Everything we've fought for comes down to this. We've shown the people the truth, and now we have to finish what we started. Together we can end this. The room erupted in a chorus of agreement, their resolve unshakable. The tunnels were eerily silent, the only sounds the muffled footsteps of Elijah's team and the distant drip of water. The air was thick and cold, and the darkness pressed in around them. Miriam led the way, her flashlight cutting through the gloom as she consulted a tattered map. We're close, she whispered, another 100 meters. The team moved cautiously, every creak and shuffle magnified in the confined space. At last they reached a steel grate blocking their path. Miriam knelt down, her tools clinking softly as she worked to dismantle the lock. Elijah kept his weapon at the ready, his eyes scanning the shadows. How much longer? Almost there, Miriam replied, her voice calm despite the tension. With a soft click, the lock gave way and the grate swung open. The team slipped through, emerging into the cathedral's lower levels. The air was warmer here, tinged with the faint scent of incense and oil. This is where it gets tricky, Miriam said, motioning for the team to stay close. The security systems are likely still active. They navigated the labyrinthine corridors, avoiding patrols and bypassing surveillance cameras. Miriam worked quickly at each checkpoint, her hands steady as she disabled alarms and unlocked doors. Finally, they reached the cathedral's main gates. From their concealed position, they could see the council gathered on a raised platform, surrounded by enforcers. The high priest stood at the center, his voice booming as he addressed the loyalists. These rebels seek to destroy all that is sacred, he declared. But we are the chosen. We will cleanse this city of their corruption and restore order. Elijah's jaw tightened. We need to act now. The assault began with a deafening explosion as the resistance outside launched their attack. The enforcers scrambled to respond, their attention drawn away from the gates. Taking advantage of the chaos, Elijah's team moved swiftly, disabling the locks and throwing the gates open. The resistance poured in, a tide of determined fighters surging toward the heart of the cathedral. The clash was brutal, the grand hall echoing with the sounds of gunfire and shouts. Elijah fought his way through the chaos, his focus unwavering as he pushed toward the platform. The high priest stood defiant, his voice rising above the fray. You think you can overthrow us? The covenant devices are eternal. You will never. His words were cut short as Elijah reached him, his weapon trained on the priest's chest. It's over. Elijah said coldly. "Your lies end here." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a flick of his wrist, the high priest triggered a hidden mechanism. The monitors around the hall came to life, displaying a countdown. Miriam's voice crackled over Elijah's comm. "Elijah, he's trying to reactivate the implants. If that timer hits 0, Elijah didn't wait. He lunged forward, knocking the device from the priest's hand and wrestling him to the ground. The crowd surged around them, the resistance fighters pushing back the enforcers as the struggle continued. Finally, with the help of his team, Elijah subdued the priest and disabled the mechanism. The countdown froze, the threat of reactivation averted. As the fighting subsided, the resistance emerged victorious. The council was captured, their leaders stripped of their power. The cathedral, once a symbol of oppression, now stood as a monument to the people's triumph. Elijah stood in the grand hall, his gaze sweeping over the resistance fighters and citizens gathered there. Miriam approached, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and pride. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it," Elijah corrected. "But the real work starts now." He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying through the hall. "This is our moment. We've taken back our city, but we must rebuild it together. No more lies, no more fear. This is the dawn of a new era." The hall erupted in cheers, the sound reverberating through the cathedral and out into the streets. The theocracy had fallen, and the people had reclaimed their freedom. Chapter 9. A New Covenant. The days following the fall of the cathedral were a blur of activity and emotion. The city, once subdued under the theocracy's iron grip, pulsed with newfound energy. Streets that had been barren were now filled with citizens dismantling statues, tearing down banners, and erasing symbols of oppression. For the first time in generations, the people were shaping their own destiny. Elijah stood at the balcony of the cathedral, which now served as the resistance's provisional headquarters. Below him, a sea of people gathered in the main square. Their faces were a mixture of hope, uncertainty, and determination. Beside him stood Miriam, Marcus, and other key members of the resistance. "You've got their attention," Miriam said, nudging Elijah. "Now, give them a reason to believe in what's next." Elijah stepped forward, his voice steady as it carried over the crowd. "Citizens," he began, "today we stand together, free of the chains that bound us. But freedom is not just the absence of tyranny. It is the presence of justice, compassion, and unity. We must build a society where no one is above the truth and no one lives in fear of it." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising like a wave. Elijah continued, his tone resolute. "The devices that controlled us are gone, but the scars remain. Healing will take time, but together we can create something better, something lasting. This is our chance to write a new covenant, one forged not by fear, but by trust." Miriam placed a hand on his shoulder as the cheers grew louder. "You've given them hope," she said. "That's more powerful than anything the theocracy ever wielded." As the resistance transitioned into governance, challenges quickly emerged. The infrastructure left behind by the theocracy was both a blessing and a curse. While the systems were advanced, they were deeply rooted in control and surveillance. Repurposing them into tools of empowerment required ingenuity and trust. Miriam led efforts to dismantle the remnants of the covenant devices. Teams of engineers worked tirelessly, deactivating implants and ensuring they could never be used again. For many, the removal of the implants was an emotional experience, a physical shedding of the oppression they had endured for so long. Elijah, meanwhile, focused on creating a new council to guide the rebuilding process. Representatives from all sectors of the city were elected, their voices reflecting the diverse needs of the people. Transparency became the cornerstone of the new government, with open forums and public decision-making replacing the secrecy of the past. One evening, as the city settled into its newfound rhythm, Elijah found himself walking the quiet streets. The glow of lanterns lit his path, and the distant hum of activity was a comforting reminder of progress. He paused at a small square where a group of children played, their laughter filling the air. "You're a long way from the cathedral," Miriam's voice came from behind him. Elijah turned, smiling faintly. "Sometimes I need to see the city from ground level. It reminds me what we're fighting for." Miriam stepped closer, her expression soft. "You've done more than fight, Elijah. You've led." He sighed, the weight of leadership evident in his posture. I just hope it's enough. People are looking to us for answers, but we're building something that's never existed before. That's what makes it worth it, Miriam said. The theocracy taught people to fear change, but you've shown them it's possible. That's a legacy worth fighting for. Despite the progress, not everyone embraced the new order. Pockets of loyalists to the theocracy resisted, their allegiance to the old regime rooted in fear and tradition. Small uprisings disrupted the city's fragile peace, forcing the resistance to remain vigilant. One such incident occurred in the northern district, where a group of loyalists attempted to seize a supply depot. Elijah led the response personally, determined to show that the resistance would not tolerate a return to tyranny. The confrontation was brief but intense. When the dust settled, the loyalists had been subdued, and the depot was secure. Among the captives was a former enforcer who had once patrolled the streets with an iron fist. "You think you're different," the man spat as he was escorted away. "But power corrupts. You'll become just like us." Elijah's gaze was steady as he replied, "We're not here to rule. We're here to rebuild, and the people will hold us accountable." As the weeks turned into months, the city began to transform. Public spaces once used for displays of theocracy propaganda became forums for art, education, and debate. The cathedral's spires, once a symbol of oppression, were repurposed to house archives documenting the truth of what had happened. Elijah often visited these archives, his heart heavy with the weight of history. One evening, he stood before a display of artifacts from the theocracy's reign, the schematics of the covenant devices, recordings of indoctrination ceremonies, and testimonies from those who had suffered. Miriam joined him, her presence a steadying force. "It's important that we remember," she said, "not just the pain, but the strength it took to overcome it." Elijah nodded. "The theocracy controlled us by erasing the past. If we forget, we risk repeating it." On the anniversary of the cathedral's fall, the city gathered once more in the main square. Elijah stood before the crowd, his heart swelling with pride and hope. The city was not perfect, but it was alive, vibrant, and determined. "Today," he began, "we celebrate not just the end of tyranny, but the beginning of something new. We honor those who sacrificed for our freedom and commit ourselves to the future they dreamed of." He paused, letting the moment sink in. Covenant. To uphold truth, to protect each other, and to build a society where freedom is not a privilege, but a right. Together, we will honor this promise, not because we are commanded, but because we choose to. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the streets. Miriam stepped beside him, her smile bright. "You've done it, Elijah." "We've done it," he corrected, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "And we're just getting started." As the city celebrated, Elijah felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time, it felt possible. The people had reclaimed their lives, their truth, and their future. Chapter 10. Beyond the Covenant. The second year of freedom dawned with cautious optimism. The city, once shrouded in fear and submission, was alive with the rhythm of progress. Markets flourished, schools reopened, and public squares echoed with debates and celebrations. Yet for Elijah, Miriam, and the other leaders of the resistance, the true test of their revolution was just beginning. Elijah sat in a modest office within the repurposed cathedral, the morning sun filtering through stained glass windows that once glorified the theocracy. Now, those same windows bore new symbols, depictions of unity, knowledge, and hope. On his desk lay a stack of proposals, each representing a step toward solidifying the foundations of the new society. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Miriam entered, a tablet in hand. "We've finalized the education reform plan," she said, placing it before him. "The first wave of schools will start teaching next week." Elijah smiled, the weight of the document lightened by the hope it carried. "Education is where it begins," he said. "If we teach the next generation to think critically, we can ensure the past doesn't repeat itself." Miriam nodded. "We've also included a mandate to teach the history of the theocracy. Every lie, every manipulation. The truth will be our strongest defense." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "It's strange," he said. "For so long we fought to survive, to resist. Now, we're building something entirely new. It's terrifying and exhilarating." Change always is, Miriam replied. But we're not alone in this. The people believe in what we're doing. That's our greatest strength. Despite the progress, challenges remained. Isolated regions still clung to the remnants of the theocracy's influence, their loyalty fueled by fear of the unknown. The new council worked tirelessly to bring these regions into the fold, balancing diplomacy with firm resolve. Elijah and Marcus led a delegation to one such region, a remote village nestled in the hills where resistance to change had been strong. They were greeted with suspicion, the villagers wary of outsiders. The scars of the theocracy's rule were evident in their guarded expressions and quiet demeanor. "We're not here to impose," Elijah said during a gathering in the village square. "We're here to listen, to understand your fears, and to work together for a better future." A woman stepped forward, her voice trembling. "They told us we'd die without the devices, that we'd be lost without the commandments. How do we trust that this new way won't destroy us?" Elijah met her gaze, his voice steady. "The devices weren't there to protect you. They were there to control you. What we're building is different. It's not about control. It's about choice. You have the right to question, to challenge, and to grow. That's what..." The woman's eyes filled with tears, her expression softening. Slowly, the villagers began to open up, their fear replaced by cautious hope. Back in the city, Miriam spearheaded efforts to establish a new constitution. The process was arduous, involving input from citizens across all walks of life. Town halls were held in every district, allowing voices to be heard and ideas to be debated. One evening, Miriam and Elijah reviewed the draft together in his office. "This is it," Miriam said, sliding the document across the desk. "The foundation of our future." Elijah read the opening lines aloud, his voice filled with emotion. "We, the people, in pursuit of truth, justice, and unity, hereby declare that no authority shall rule over us without our consent, and no law shall stand without our understanding." He set the document down, his eyes meeting Miriam's. "It's beautiful," he said, "but more than that, it's a promise." The Constitution was ratified in a public ceremony, attended by thousands. Elijah stood before the crowd, the weight of history in his hands as he held the document aloft. "This is our covenant," he declared, "a covenant not of fear but of trust, a covenant written not for us but for those who come after." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the city. For a moment, Elijah allowed himself to bask in the triumph, the culmination of years of struggle. As the months passed, the city continued to evolve. The council transitioned from a revolutionary body to a governing force, its members elected by the people. Miriam, reluctant at first, accepted a leadership role, her expertise and vision indispensable to the fledgling government. Elijah, however, found himself drawn away from the halls of power. The fight had changed him, and though he believed in the new order, his heart longed for something quieter. One morning, he approached Miriam as she reviewed a stack of reports. "I think it's time for me to step back," he said. Miriam looked up, her expression a mixture of surprise and understanding. "You've earned that right," she said. "But the city will miss you." "I'll always be here if I'm needed," Elijah replied. "But this is bigger than me. It belongs to the people now." Elijah left the city soon after, settling in a quiet village on the outskirts of the region. He spent his days tending a small garden, mentoring young leaders, and reflecting on the journey that had brought him there. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a group of children approached him, their eyes wide with curiosity. "Tell us the story," one of them said. "The story of how you freed us." Elijah chuckled, motioning for them to sit. "It wasn't just me," he said. "It was all of us, together. And it's not just a story, it's a lesson. A reminder that the greatest power lies not in control, but in choice." As he spoke, the children listened intently, their faces lit by the fading light of the setting sun. And in that moment, Elijah felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that the future was in good hands. End of Commandment, Genesis.